The hum of the restaurant was a low, expensive thrum. It was the sound of money breathing, a quiet symphony of clinking silver, hushed conversation, and the distant hiss of the espresso machine. Naomi moved through it like a ghost in her crisp white shirt and black apron, her presence large but unobtrusive. She was good at her job. She knew how to be invisible, how to anticipate a need before it was spoken, how to make the wealthy patrons feel as though their water glasses refilled themselves. At 20, she carried the weight of her world in the tired set of her shoulders, a burden unseen by the people who ordered $100 steaks without looking at the price. The afternoon light slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was the quiet time, the lull between the lunch rush and the evening crush. Naomi was polishing wine glasses behind the bar, the repetitive circular motion a familiar comfort. That was when the air in the room changed. It was a subtle shift, a drop in pressure, the way the air grows heavy and still before a storm. The low hum of conversation faltered. Forks paused halfway to mouths. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she watched the reflection in the glass she held. A man had entered, flanked by two others. They did not move like customers. They moved like predators who owned the forest, their steps silent and deliberate on the polished marble. The man in the center was a masterpiece of lethal tailoring. His suit was a dark charcoal, probably Tom Ford, cut so precisely it seemed molded to the lean, hard lines of his body. He was not large, but he commanded space, drawing the energy of the room toward him until he was its unmoving center. He took the corner booth, the one with a clear view of the entire restaurant and both exits. His men stood, one by the entrance, one near the back. They did not sit. They did not order. They simply existed, two pillars of quiet menace. Naomi finished her glass, setting it down with a soft click. Her manager, a perpetually nervous man named Mr. Davies, was already scurrying over, his smile stretched thin and brittle. Naomi kept her head down, focusing on her work. She could feel the man's gaze, though, a palpable weight against her skin. It was not the leering look she sometimes got from businessmen after their third martini. This was different. It was analytical, cold, the way a jeweler might examine a stone for its flaws. A fourth man, younger and sweating in his own expensive but ill-fitting suit, was ushered to the booth. He sat opposite the man in charcoal, his posture rigid with fear. Naomi could not hear their words, only the murmur of their voices, one a low, steady current, the other a series of frantic, clipped responses. The tension coiled tighter and tighter, a physical thing in the air. Then, a sharp crack. The young man flinched, as if struck. The man in the charcoal suit had not moved, but a crystal glass of whiskey on the edge of the table lay shattered on the floor, its amber contents pooling on the pristine white marble. It had been an almost imperceptible movement, a flick of a finger, a twitch of a hand. An accident that was not an accident at all. Mr. Davies was about to rush over, but one of the standing men put a hand on his chest, a silent, absolute command. Then, the man in the booth lifted his chin, his dark eyes finally landing directly on Naomi. He beckoned her with a single, elegant finger. Her heart gave a hard, painful thud against her ribs. This was wrong. All of it. But she was a waitress. She answered when called. She smoothed down her apron, took a steadying breath, and walked toward the booth. Her footsteps felt unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice even. He did not look at the mess on the floor. His eyes, the color of black coffee, stayed on her face. They were intelligent, ancient eyes, holding a depth of coldness she had only ever seen in pictures of Arctic landscapes. "My associate," he began, his voice a low, smooth baritone with no discernible accent, "is clumsy. He tells me he saw you brush against the table as you passed. That you knocked this over." He gestured vaguely toward the shattered glass. The young man across from him went pale, his eyes wide with a desperate plea. It was a lie. A blatant, transparent lie. Naomi had been 20 feet away, behind the bar. Everyone in the restaurant knew it. The test was not about the glass. It was about the lie. She could see the paths laid out before her. She could apologize, accept the blame, and Mr. Davies would take the cost of the ridiculously expensive whiskey out of her meager pay. That was the safe route. The path of the invisible girl. Or she could tell the truth. She looked from the terrified face of the young man to the impassive, carved features of the man who held all the power in this small, suspended universe. He was waiting, testing her. He wanted to see if she would break, if she would bend to a reality he had just invented. Naomi took a small breath. She met his gaze directly. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick silence. "With all due respect, your associate is mistaken." A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the nearby tables. The young man looked like he was about to faint. The man in the charcoal suit did not blink. His expression remained unchanged, but she saw something flicker deep in his eyes. A spark of interest. "I was behind the bar for the last 10 minutes, Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. She would not be baited into disrespect, only into fact. "I saw your hand make contact with the glass from across the room." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy and profound. The young man stared at her, his mouth agape. The two standing guards shifted their weight, their eyes now fixed on her. Mr. Davies looked like he might actually cry. She had not just corrected a customer. She had contradicted a man who radiated a kind of authority that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with violence. The man leaned back in the booth, the fine wool of his suit jacket pulling taut across his shoulders. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He was taking her apart piece by piece, examining her resolve, her fear, her defiance. Then, the corner of his mouth tilted in a smile that was not a smile at all. It was a verdict. "Clean it up," he said, his voice soft. It was not directed at her. He waved a dismissive hand at the young man, who scrambled to his feet, bowing low before practically fleeing the restaurant. The man's eyes returned to Naomi. "Your shift is over," he stated. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a fact. "Sir, I don't finish for another 3 hours," she said, confused. "You do now," he replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. He placed a few crisp $100 bills on the table, more than enough to cover the drink and a week of her salary. "I'll be waiting for you outside." He rose with a fluid grace that was almost unnerving and walked out, his two men falling into step behind him. The restaurant slowly came back to life, the hum returning, but it was strained now, fragile. Mr. Davies rushed to her side, his face ashen. "What did you do?" he whispered aghast. Naomi didn't have an answer. She only knew that she had been given an order by a man she could not refuse. She untied her apron, her hands shaking slightly, and walked through the kitchen to the employee exit. The alley air was cool on her flushed cheeks. When she stepped onto the street, she saw it. A gleaming black sedan, idling silently at the curb. The back door opened. He was inside, a silhouette in the tinted gloom, waiting. She had answered his question. Now her life was no longer her own. The inside of the car was like a sensory deprivation chamber. The scent of rich leather and something clean and masculine, cedarwood and smoke, filled the small space. The sounds of the city were muted to a distant whisper. He sat opposite her, the space between them charged with an unspoken current. Naomi stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her life slide by, feeling like she was watching them from another planet. They drove to a part of the city she had only ever seen in magazines, a gleaming steel and glass tower that pierced the clouds. The elevator was silent and swift, opening directly into a penthouse apartment that was more of a sky palace. The view was breathtaking, the entire city sprawling below them like a carpet of glittering jewels. "You will stay here," he said, his first words since the car. He walked to a wet bar and poured himself a glass of water, his movements economical and precise. "Stay here?
Why?"
"I don't understand," Naomi said, her voice small in the vast, empty space. He turned, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "You were a witness. The man you so bravely contradicted is part of a rival organization. By speaking the truth, you made yourself a target. You embarrassed him in front of me. People have been killed for far less. He took a slow sip of water. Consider this my protection. It was not protection. It was a prison. A beautiful, luxurious prison with an astonishing view, but a prison nonetheless. For how long? She asked. Until the matter is resolved. Days bled into a week. Her life became a strange routine of waking up in a room with silk sheets, eating food prepared by a silent housekeeper, and watching the city live its life below. The man, she learned his name was Tatsuya Ishikawa, was a constant, silent presence. He worked from a large desk in the main living area, his phone calls a mixture of clipped English and rapid-fire Japanese. She saw the brutal efficiency of his empire in those calls. Territories, debts, loyalty, soldiers. It was the language of a king ruling a violent kingdom. He mostly ignored her, but she watched him. She learned the way he held his shoulders when he was tense, the way his thumb would stroke the side of his phone when he was listening to a report, the way his eyes would darken when he was displeased. He was a creature of absolute control. One evening, she couldn't sleep. The silence of the penthouse was too loud. She wandered into the living area, drawn by the city lights. Tatsuya wasn't at his desk. A drawer was slightly ajar. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse she should have suppressed, got the better of her. She pulled it open. Inside, beneath a stack of stark financial documents, was a small, worn photograph. It was of a young woman with a smile so bright it seemed to light up the faded paper. She had Tatsuya's eyes, but where his were cold and hard, hers were warm and full of laughter. She was beautiful, vibrant, alive. "What are you doing?" His voice, cold as ice, sliced through the silence. Naomi jumped, dropping the photo. He was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. He strode forward, his presence radiating a chilling anger that was far more terrifying than the quiet authority he usually wore. He snatched the photo from the floor, his knuckles white.
I'm sorry.
"I couldn't sleep," she stammered. He stared down at the picture, and for a fleeting second, the mask cracked. She saw a flash of raw, agonizing pain in his eyes. It was so profound, so naked, that it stole her breath. Then it was gone, replaced by a wall of ice. "Her name was Akari," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My sister," he looked at Naomi, his gaze sharp and accusatory. "She was killed 5 years ago. By the Ozaki clan. The same people whose man you contradicted. They took her because they thought she was my weakness." The confession hung in the air between them, stark and brutal. This was his wound. The failure he carried. He hadn't just lost a sister. He had failed to protect her. It was the source of his control, his coldness, his isolation. He would never allow another weakness. Naomi suddenly understood that in his mind, that's all she was. Another potential vulnerability he was now forced to manage. The attack came 2 nights later. It was not subtle. A sudden series of loud bangs from the direction of the elevator, followed by the shattering of glass. Tatsuya moved before the sound had even faded. He grabbed her arm, his grip like steel, and pulled her away from the windows. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He moved with a dancer's deadly grace, pulling a sleek, black pistol from a hidden compartment in the wall. The apartment door splintered inward. 2 men in dark suits spilled in, guns raised. Tatsuya didn't hesitate. 2 precise shots, and they were down.
No wasted motion. No panic.
Just surgical violence. He pulled her toward a service exit she hadn't even known existed. Alarms blared through the building. They were running down a concrete stairwell, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. As they burst out into a back alley, the night air was a shock of cold. For a moment, under the chaos of flashing lights and distant sirens, she saw her chance. A crowd was gathering at the end of the alley. She could slip into it, disappear. She could run. But then she saw it. A dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt, just below the shoulder. He was bleeding. He hadn't even flinched. He was still scanning the rooftops, his focus entirely on the threat, completely ignoring his own injury. In that instant, Naomi made a choice. She could save herself, or she could help the man who had, however brutally, tried to save her. She grabbed his uninjured arm. "This way," she hissed, pulling him not toward the crowd, but deeper into the labyrinth of alleys. He looked down at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he followed. She found a small, dark alcove behind a dumpster, pulling him into the shadows. "You're hurt," she said, her voice breathless. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her shirt, her hands surprisingly steady. "You have to put pressure on it." He watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His blood was warm on her fingers as she pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound. They were close. So close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the tiny lines around his eyes. The city's chaotic symphony was the soundtrack to their silent, charged moment. He was leaning against the brick wall, the gun still in his hand, but his eyes were on her. He said her name, Naomi. It sounded different. Not like an owner naming a possession, but like a man seeing someone for the first time. The silence in that grimy alley was more intimate than any conversation. She had had her chance to run, and she had chosen to stay. That choice had changed everything. The safe house was a sterile, minimalist apartment in a nondescript building across town. It had none of the penthouse's luxury, only the cold comfort of anonymity. The tension from the alley followed them, a third presence in the room. Naomi cleaned and bandaged his wound with supplies from a first aid kit, her movements practiced and gentle. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her every move, his silence a heavy blanket. The intimacy born from violence was a strange, disorienting thing. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin under her fingertips, the solid muscle of his arm. She told herself it was just adrenaline, a survival instinct. But it was a lie, and she knew it. 2 days passed in quiet, watchful proximity. Then the Ozaki clan found them again. This time, the assault was a storm. The front door exploded inward, and the small apartment was filled with motion and noise. Tatsuya moved to put himself between her and the door, a shield of flesh and fury. He was magnificent and terrifying, a whirlwind of calculated violence. But there were too many of them. Naomi watched in horror as one of Ozaki's men got behind him. The man raised his gun. Tatsuya was occupied with 2 others, his back exposed. There was no time to shout a warning. No time for anything. In that split second, Naomi's world narrowed to that one man, that one threat. Her survival instinct, honed by years of navigating a world that was not kind to poor, black women, took over. Her eyes landed on a heavy, ceramic table lamp on the end table beside her.
She didn't think.
She acted. She lunged, grabbing the lamp's heavy base, and swung it with all the force in her body. It connected with the back of the man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. The room fell silent. Tatsuya had dispatched the others. He turned, his chest heaving, and saw her. She was standing over the unconscious man, the broken lamp still in her hands, her knuckles white. Her entire body was trembling, a cocktail of fear and adrenaline coursing through her. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross. The invisible waitress had committed an act of brutal violence. She dropped the lamp, the pieces shattering on the floor. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Tatsuya crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't look at the man on the floor. He looked at her. He reached out, his fingers gently touching a bruise that was already forming on her cheek where she'd been knocked against the wall in the chaos. His touch was featherlight, a stark contrast to the violence that had just filled the room. "No one," he said, his voice rough, raw, "has ever fought for me. It was not a thank you. It was a confession. An admission of a lifetime of solitude, of being the protector, the shield, the king who stood alone." Naomi met his gaze, her own fear receding, replaced by a dangerous, undeniable truth. "I told myself," she whispered, her voice shaking, "that staying was just about surviving. I think I was lying. The admission hung between them, more powerful than any declaration of love. It was something deeper, more primal. A recognition. In his world of violence and betrayal, she had become an anchor. In her world of invisibility and struggle, he had become a reason to fight. The aftermath of the attack was a blur. One of Tatsuya's men arrived, cleaned up the mess, and they moved again, this time to a secluded house far outside the city limits. The war with the Ozaki clan had escalated. But the next blow was not aimed at Tatsuya's empire. It was aimed directly at his heart. A day later, a text message arrived on his phone. He opened it, and his entire body went rigid. He turned the screen toward her. It was a picture of a modest, slightly run-down apartment building. Her mother's building. A red circle was drawn around her mother's window. The message below it was simple. Weaknesses must be cut away. Ice flooded Naomi's veins. They had found her family, her one link to the life she had left behind. This was no longer about Tatsuya's war. They had made it hers. The enemy had targeted her. And in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. He thinks you are my weakness, Tatsuya said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. He is about to find out you are my strength. He began planning the end of it. A final confrontation. His intention was clear. He would go, and she would stay behind, protected by a phalanx of his best men. She listened to him lay out the strategy with his lieutenants, her mind racing. They were planning to hit a warehouse, where the head of the Ozaki clan would be meeting. When he was finished, she spoke.
No.
The room went silent. Tatsuya and his men turned to look at her. I'm not staying here, she said, her voice firm. They came after my mother. This is my fight now, too. It is too dangerous, Tatsuya said, his tone final. You're planning to attack the old wharfside cannery, right? She asked, ignoring him. The men exchanged surprised glances. I used to work there. A summer job, packing fish. I know that building better than any of you. I know the old service tunnels they walled up in the 80s. I know the dumbwaiter shaft that goes from the loading bay directly to the old foreman's office. The one your blueprints won't show. Tatsuya stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and something else.
Awe.
She was not a liability to be protected. She was an asset. A weapon he hadn't known he possessed. The choice was no longer his to make. The air in the cannery was thick with the smell of salt, rust, and decay. It was a skeleton of a building, filled with shadows and ghosts. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was sharp, focused. She led Tatsuya and a small team through a crumbling maintenance tunnel, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. They emerged behind Ozaki's main force, in a position they never would have anticipated. The firefight was sudden and brutal. The cavernous space erupted with the roar of gunfire. Tatsuya's plan went sideways almost immediately. Ozaki had more men than they'd anticipated. They were pinned down behind a stack of rotting crates. This was it, the moment of truth. While Tatsuya and his men provided covering fire, Naomi slipped away, back into the shadows she knew so well. She was not a soldier. She did not have a gun. But she had knowledge. She found the main power breaker for the building's ancient refrigeration units. With a heave, she threw the switch. The massive generators sputtered to life with a deafening groan, plunging half the warehouse into darkness and creating a chaotic, disorienting noise. In the confusion, she made her way to the old loading bay controls and slammed her hand down on the button to open the massive bay doors. Cold night air and the blinding headlights of a passing freighter flooded the space, silhouetting Ozaki's men, making them perfect targets. It was the opening Tatsuya needed. The tide of the battle turned in an instant. Naomi didn't stay to watch. She had done her part. She saved him. When it was over, the silence that descended was heavy, punctuated only by the distant lapping of water against the pier. Tatsuya found her in the foreman's office, looking out the grimy window at the dark water. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his perfect suit torn and stained, but he was alive. He didn't say anything. He just came to stand beside her. The violence was done, the threat neutralized. Her old life was gone forever. Her mother was already being moved to a new, secret home under his protection. The cost of this night was her entire past. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no guard, no wall, no Arctic cold in his eyes. There was only a raw, undisguised truth. "My world will never be safe," he said, his voice quiet. "But I have discovered that without you, it is also empty." It was not a proposal. It was not a promise. It was an acknowledgement. A statement of fact. He was the king of a dark and violent empire, and she, the waitress from the quiet restaurant, had become its center. He held out his hand. It was not a gesture of rescue, not an offer of aid. It was an invitation, a choice, to step fully into his world, to stand beside him not as a protected liability, but as a partner. His queen. Naomi looked at his hand, scarred and stained, the hand that had shattered a glass and ended lives. Then she looked up at his face, at the man who saw her, truly saw her, not as a size or a color or a job, but as the one person who had not bent to his power, but had instead forged her own. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. The space between them was electric, a universe of unspoken understanding. Taking his hand was not an end. It was the beginning of something terrifying and beautiful and absolute. And in the heavy silence of the ruined cannery, she chose.